For many of today's young people, a sense of dread and impending doom is the prevailing feeling when thinking about the future of our world. Many young people even cite climate anxiety and environmental concerns as a reason that they aren't having children. One of the main priorities of governments, corporations, and people around the world is to achieve an energy transition, to move towards a carbon-free future. Bitcoin is often attacked for its energy consumption, with many drawing attention to the fact that the mining industry around Bitcoin uses as much electricity as some small to medium-sized countries. But is this fair? Missing from much of the mainstream conversation around the future of humanity's energy consumption is a recognition that increasing energy consumption is integral to improving human standards of living. Central heating, air conditioning, the transportation of food, water, and the manufacture of shoes and clothing. If we are to improve the quality of life of the world's poorest people, the aim must be to help them consume more energy. In the future, it's likely that we won't have to consume energy from fossil fuels. Missing from the debate around climate change is an acknowledgement of the fact that when humans are able to use more energy, humanity flourishes. Plus, in the context of improving humanity's standard of living, Bitcoin is worth the energy it uses. A single unit of account for all of humanity, a global payment network that drastically lowers the barrier to entry for participation in the global economy, a dependable store of value for those living in inflationary monetary regimes. By restoring sound money to the people, which preserves their purchasing power and respects the value of their time, Bitcoin will unleash human ingenuity on a scale never seen before. Bitcoin is far more important than the mainstream conversation around it would suggest. Bitcoiners have for years been saying that Bitcoin is a force for good within the energy industry, that it will reshape the energy grid in its image. But mainstream news outlets continue to recycle the same tired, skeptical narratives. So what does it mean when Aker, one of the largest oil and gas producers in Norway, says that they are going to invest $500 million into Bitcoin mining operations that use stranded, renewable energy? Not only that, but Aker's announcement letter suggests that Bitcoin could accelerate the energy transition by improving the economics for new renewable projects. In this video, we're going to digest the Aker shareholder announcement letter, including what it means for Bitcoin within the context of the energy transition and the inevitability of Bitcoin as a global reserve asset and inclusive payment network. Hello team. So today we're going to be digesting the shareholder letter that Aker's chairman released yesterday to announce that they were investing $500 million in starting a new company which would be involved in Bitcoin. So the article is really bullish for a lot of different reasons. And what I love about it is that it's written by someone with skin in the game, with real investment on the line, with real reputation on the line, who understands the energy industry and clearly understands Bitcoin very well. So this letter, it touches on a lot of things that Bitcoiners have been talking about for years. But the thing is, we haven't had a kind of an example to point to, because it's always been this thing that we anticipated happening, the fusion and the integration between Bitcoin and the energy industry. Now, what I love about this letter is that here is someone with skin in the game, an existing established player in the energy industry, recognizing the opportunity that Bitcoiners have been talking about for years. It's so bullish for so many reasons. I love it, and I think you're going to love it too. So let's dive in. Let's try and understand the perspective of Aker's chairman, and let's kind of pull apart and tease apart some of the themes that are being spoken about in this letter. So there are a lot of interesting things within this letter. Now the first theme is the way that Aker and their chairman, Kjell Inge Rokke, clearly see Bitcoin as money. So get this. Today we announced that Aker has established Seetee, a new company that will invest in exciting projects and companies throughout the Bitcoin ecosystem, while keeping all of its liquid investable assets in Bitcoin. So essentially what they're saying there is that they've adopted the Bitcoin standard. Bitcoin is their store of value and unit of account. This is similar to the way Michael Saylor, CEO of MicroStrategy, who were the first public company to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, sees Bitcoin. It's not just about making an investment or an allocation to Bitcoin. It's about adopting Bitcoin as your store of value and unit of account. It's about adopting Bitcoin as money. And I just find that hugely bullish. He goes on to say, before I proceed with our story, I want to state upfront that I am aware that Bitcoin is often criticized for a number of perceived challenges, including its electricity consumption, its inability to scale with respect to transactions, and its potential to facilitate anonymous, illegitimate payments. We believe that Bitcoin can be a solution rather than a problem for each of these, but we'll get to the arguments for that later. Now, I love that. What this says to me is that this guy gets it, right? Because straight away, he's identified and kind of summarized really succinctly the three main arguments that Bitcoin skeptics use to attack the idea of Bitcoin. He acknowledges them up front and clearly understands that in the grand scheme of things, these things aren't real problems for Bitcoin, and that there's very little merit in them, in any of them, when you study Bitcoin closely. He goes on to say that the team at Seetee is already running open source Bitcoin payment servers and will remain active contributors in the community. Now, we spoke about the fact that they've adopted the Bitcoin standard in terms of treating Bitcoin as their unit of account and store of value. Those are only two of the three functions of money. The third function of money is medium of exchange, the token you use to exchange instead of exchanging goods directly for one another, which obviously, through having a medium of exchange, it removes limits to trade. And in telling us that the team at Seetee is already running open source Bitcoin payment servers, he's telling us that Seetee want to support and adopt Bitcoin as their medium of exchange. So as far as this first theme that we've teased out of this letter is concerned, according to the third largest oil and gas producer in Norway, Bitcoin is money. According to the three functions of money, store of value, unit of account, and medium of exchange, as far as Seetee are concerned and Aker are concerned, and the chairman of Aker, the second or first richest man in Norway, are concerned, Bitcoin is money. So the second interesting thing to come out of this letter is the fact that this huge energy company see Bitcoin as what they call an economic battery. They clearly recognize that the Bitcoin mining industry and the energy industry are likely to integrate and become one, while also recognizing the implications that Bitcoin has for the energy grid and the potential for Bitcoin to reshape the energy grid and much of the energy industry in its image. This is huge. This is stuff that Bitcoiners have been talking about for years, thinking it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But this is the first time that I know of that a huge player in the existing legacy energy industry has come forward, put money on the table, $500 million on the table in the case of Aker, and said, we think this is the future, we're putting skin in the game, and we're investing to make this happen. So let's get to the quote. So, second, Seetee will establish mining operations that transfer stranded or intermittent electricity without stable demand locally, wind, solar, hydropower, to economic assets that can be used anywhere. Bitcoin is, in our eyes, a load balancing economic battery, and batteries are essential to the energy transition required to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement. Our ambition is to be a valuable partner in new renewable projects. So to give you some of the background on this and to kind of fill you in on a lot of the conversation that Bitcoiners have been having, which has led to many having anticipated this for years. Energy is very difficult and expensive to transport, and what that means is populations tend to be centered around and clustered around sources of energy, and the only energy projects that tend to get funded are those which are close enough to population centers that the energy which is produced can find a buyer, can find a residential or commercial market. So in other words, much of the energy industry is kind of geographically dependent. Geographical reality shapes the energy industry, determines which projects get funded and which don't, which projects are economically viable and which aren't. But the thing with Bitcoin is, the network is completely location agnostic. So when it comes to Bitcoin mining, it doesn't matter where you are. All that matters is you have a source of energy that you can turn into electricity, some computers so that you can turn that electricity into CPU power, and an internet connection so that you can use that CPU power to participate as a miner in the Bitcoin network. So in other words, Bitcoin mining creates a demand for energy that is geographically agnostic, location agnostic. So as long as you have those things, you can use whatever source of energy you can find anywhere in the world to mine Bitcoin. And therefore lots of different new energy projects become economically viable that previously weren't, because the existing energy market is so geographically dependent because of how difficult it is to transport energy around. So anyone who wants to be profitable when mining Bitcoins has to find the cheapest source of electricity that they possibly can, because their income is largely fixed. There's not much you can do about it. So as a miner, you receive your income in Bitcoins, and that income varies as a function of the fees that have been paid by users who wanted to get a transaction into that block, and the price of Bitcoin, because you receive your income in Bitcoins. So for a miner, there's not much you can do about that side of the equation. However, what you can do something about is the costs on the other side of the equation. So you have your income, that's your income in Bitcoins, and you have your costs, which essentially vary as a function of the price of electricity. As a miner, the cheaper the electricity you can access, the more profitable your mining activities will be. So in other words, the Bitcoin mining industry demands that miners find the cheapest possible source of electricity, and crucially, it doesn't care where on earth this is found. This is completely transformative. All of a sudden we have this huge financial incentive to seek out the cheapest possible sources of electricity and to use that to mine Bitcoins. Now, the anticipation from Bitcoiners was that this would see lots of different projects get commissioned that would previously have been economically unviable. Because if you're a player in the energy industry who's thinking of making an investment in some energy infrastructure, but you weren't sure that this project would be able to transport the electricity that it produces to some population centre, and therefore you weren't certain that there would be demand for the energy that you would produce, and therefore that project would be worth investing in. Now, thanks to Bitcoin and thanks to the Bitcoin mining opportunity, you have some of that risk and some of that downside taken away. Because even if you can't find demand for your energy in some local residential or commercial market, you can use that energy that you're now producing, as long as it's cheap enough, to profitably mine Bitcoin. This is huge. It completely redesigns the incentives that are within the energy industry and the incentives of those who are thinking of developing some energy infrastructure. And ultimately, as Bitcoiners have been anticipating for a while, will ultimately come to reshape the energy grid in Bitcoin's image. It's absolutely huge. It's such a big deal for someone with skin in the game who knows the industry to come out and put $500 million on the line and essentially validate this thesis. So as an example of a Bitcoin advocate anticipating this move from some large energy player, I'm just going to read out an excerpt of the Stone Ridge 2020 shareholder letter that the CEO, Ross Stevens, sent out to shareholders and went kind of viral on Bitcoin Twitter as further validation of this thesis. So he says, "Today, every day, 24/7, Bitcoiners around the world make the decision that the price of Bitcoin's energy use is worth it because Bitcoin is better technology for money. Second, the practice. Bitcoin mining is the only profitable use of energy in human history that does not need to be located near human settlement to operate. The long-term implications of this are world-changing and hiding in plain sight. Before Bitcoin, the problem of energy has never been its scarcity, but only our ability to channel it geographically where it is needed most. Before Bitcoin, that was exclusively where humans lived. In contrast, Bitcoin's mining energy is solving a different problem. Because of satellites and wireless internet connections, Bitcoin mining can be located anywhere. For example, remote, destitute areas blessed with moving water can monetize their natural resource good fortune by creating clean hydro energy and using it to mine Bitcoin. Thus, Bitcoin can make monetizable, isolated energy sources all over the world, like waterfalls, running rivers, or creatable dams, now entirely untapped because they would be cost prohibitive to connect to electric grids close enough to residential or industrial areas. In doing so, Bitcoin can fundamentally change the economics of energy by introducing a highly profitable use of electricity that's location independent. The world has never had a profitable use of energy that is location independent. Now it does. And since fossil fuels are already too expensive to be a profitable source of Bitcoin mining energy, I believe the only long-term profitable Bitcoin mining will be powered by hydro. Historically, our energy challenge has been to move the power to the people. With Bitcoin, we can move the people to the power. As Bitcoin finances the for-profit development of cheap, clean energy infrastructure on a massive scale, it can lead to a future in which more and more of the world's population lives near abundant energy with an extraordinarily low marginal cost of production. This matters because cheap energy equals human flourishing. Beyond the revolution in monetary policy that Bitcoin already represents, Bitcoin may also represent the biggest catalyst the world has ever known for developing abundant, clean, cheap energy, and therefore one of the biggest catalysts in the world for human flourishing. So I can't say it much better than that, really. Bitcoin's implications for the energy industry have been anticipated for a while and are really kind of quite exciting. But I think for a while it was kind of seen as this like pie in the sky, really hopeful, possibly quite naive thing on the part of Bitcoiners. Whereas here we have in Aker and Seetee, a huge player in the energy industry, putting a massive amount of money on the line, giving themselves skin in the game and saying, we believe this thesis, we're going to work to make it a reality. Okay, so moving on. Next, he kind of puts Bitcoin into context by comparing it with the early internet and kind of where we are in Bitcoin's development and the likely future ecosystem of applications that will develop around it. He compares it to the internet and draws parallels with that, just to kind of talk about how disruptive and how big a deal it is and will be. While precursors existed earlier, most would agree that Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web from 1990 was the start of what we recognise as the internet. Today we take it for granted, but it has only been around for 30 years and the development has accelerated. Commentary on the internet's lack of useful applications and expert forecasts about its likely demise were frequent in the 1990s. Bitcoin was invented in 2009 and will go through waves of development before it achieves the application maturity that we are used to on the internet now. So clearly putting Bitcoin into context and comparing it and drawing parallels with the internet itself. Because what most who understand Bitcoin get is that Bitcoin is an incredibly important thing. However, it's not the whole thing, and that a whole financial system will grow up around Bitcoin as the base layer asset for transferring digital scarcity and value between participants in a peer-to-peer way. Now in this context, it's easy to see why the chairman of Aker and now Seetee sees not investing in Bitcoin as more risky than investing. Because this is something you often hear leveled at Bitcoin, oh, investing in Bitcoin is risky. But as you come to understand Bitcoin a bit better, what you come to understand is that not investing in Bitcoin is more risky than investing in it. So let's read the quote. Risk is not an obvious concept. What's commonly considered risky is frequently not, and vice versa. We are used to thinking that cash is risk-free, but it's not. It's implicitly taxed by inflation at a small rate every year. This adds up. He goes on to say, so what's risk? It's all relative. In 2018, Twitter hashtag #GetOffZero started to circulate. The main argument, it may be irresponsible not to include some exposure to Bitcoin, given the asymmetric return properties. And he goes on to say, Bitcoin may still go to zero, but it can also become the core of a new monetary architecture. If so, one Bitcoin may be worth millions of dollars. The asymmetry is interesting to a portfolio. People who know the most about Bitcoin believe its future success is nearly inevitable, whereas the other camp think that its failure is equally certain. Status quo is not possible. So from this perspective, consider the fact that people like to think cash and just holding national currencies as risk-free. But the thing is, yes, it might be certain, but by attempting to preserve one's purchasing power with cash, all you're doing is guaranteeing with certainty that that cash will lose purchasing power every year due to inflation. So yes, that might be not risky, but at the same time, is that really a desirable outcome? Now, I actually disagree that Bitcoin could go to zero. It could drop in value, definitely, but there's no way that the network becomes worth zero in time. And I think he's kind of just ceding a point for the sake of argument to Bitcoin's critics here. But the core point is one that I really like, that given the asymmetric upside of the Bitcoin bet, not holding it is more risky than holding it. And especially when measured against cash, where the downside is pretty much guaranteed, And I guess he's just reframing an investment in Bitcoin to kind of encourage people to take a different perspective on risk. Now, the next theme is one that I really appreciate, because I think critics from Bitcoin who approach critiquing Bitcoin from a kind of energy perspective, and this perspective that Bitcoin just consumes energy for no good reason, what these people often miss is that Bitcoin is hugely worthwhile. And it's easy to miss that point when you are sitting within a kind of privileged position in the West, in which you have a fairly stable currency. But fundamentally, when thinking long term, the benefit to the whole of humanity of having this global by design digital store of value that is resistant to inflation is absolutely huge. And I would love to see journalists and commentators within the mainstream media attempt to grasp this and do justice to this side of the argument. Because frequently, whenever people criticize Bitcoin for its energy consumption, they miss out this part of the debate. They don't give Bitcoin a kind of a fair and honest hearing in terms of attempting to accurately grasp its implications and its benefits for humanity. And in this letter, the chairman of Aker really gets it. So he says, yes, Bitcoin consumes electricity and pays for it at the locally prevailing market prices, but we believe Bitcoin will enable applications that can create tremendous value. If so, it will be ingrained into the social fabric and can't go to zero, since it's immune to the political forces that destroys a currency. If this scenario plays out, we might change our focus from the price of a Bitcoin to that of a Satoshi. One Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis. If our phones are full of Bitcoin applications in 5 years, the network's value is a stairway to heaven. So he's acknowledging that if Bitcoin uses electricity, then by definition it is worth it, because humans who are using Bitcoin have decided what it's worth just through their actions. And ultimately, if Bitcoin goes on to become the base layer for a new financial system, around which lots of different applications are built, then almost by definition, Bitcoin will be worth the energy it consumes. So the letter goes on to talk about this in quite a lot of detail, and I recommend giving it a read if you want the real nuance within this argument. But let's kind of move to the end and get to his summary, because he really rounds off the point very nicely. So he says, again, all of this is only commercially and economically viable if the value of verifying large transactions without a trusted third party is sufficiently high. This implies high demand for the network's architecture, which again means that useful applications that create tremendous value have been built on top of the core network. Bitcoin can therefore only survive, and electricity will only be consumed if the value created by the network is sufficient. And then he just rounds off the point beautifully. If it's a bubble, it dies and consumes nothing. If it's digital gold, it's more efficient than gold and will emit much less than the asset it disrupts. And if it's really successful, it's because of demand from truly value-creating applications that define our future and should be worth the electricity. So I love that framing. It just kind of dispels the criticism, refutes the criticism that Bitcoin shouldn't be allowed to exist because of the energy it consumes. Because essentially what he's saying is, if it isn't worth the energy that it consumes, it will go to zero and it won't consume any energy, because there'll be no demand for it, so nobody will mine Bitcoins. But if it is extremely valuable and does become important to humanity, then by definition it will be worth the energy that it consumes. And this is the key thing that those within the mainstream media, mainstream economists, and those who critique Bitcoin on environmental grounds miss. It will only consume as much energy as it is worth to humanity. Okay, so as well as all that stuff about Bitcoin and the energy industry, Kjell clearly gets the kind of Bitcoin and sound money point as well. So let's just read this bit. Like gold, Bitcoin has the ability to protect us against politicians who have the power to destroy our monetary base. Is that really necessary, you might ask? Ask Soviet pensioners whose policies are still honoured by the Russian government, although the value of those payments is bupkis because of hyperinflation in the 1990s. Strike up a conversation with a Turkish worker the next time you're on vacation, and ask how it feels to have your currency depreciate by almost 50% against the dollar in a single year. It has happened, it happens, and it will happen again. This is the point that those who don't acknowledge the kind of Bitcoin is worthwhile argument when it comes to the energy debate don't get. That just because our currencies in the West tend to be stable from year to year, that just isn't the case all around the world. And If nothing else, just having access to this reliable store of value that holds its value over the long term, because you can't create any more of it, you can't inflate the supply, unlike national currencies, is a huge benefit for so many people around the world who currently don't have that because their governments debase their currencies so quickly. It's true in Argentina, it's true in Turkey, it's been true in Russia, it's been true in Weimar Germany, and it won't stop. But with Bitcoin, all of those people have an opportunity to opt out of that system and to preserve their purchasing power, to preserve their value that they've created through their work. It respects their time, respects their work, respects their purchasing power, and it's just a huge gift for humanity to have that for the first time in history. And then, just because we're talking about how he's clearly been down the rabbit hole and he clearly gets Bitcoin very deeply from so many different perspectives. When Nixon abandoned the gold standard in 1971, a lot changed fundamentally. And then look at the reference at the bottom of the page. While causality is not guaranteed for all of these correlations, readers should browse WTF happened in 1971 for a set of interesting charts. So I'll do another video at another time about the WTF happened in 1971 phenomenon. For now, I would just recommend that anybody goes and checks out that website and the number of things that changed fundamentally in society in 1971, which was the year that we decoupled the value of our currencies from gold. So many social, economic, cultural trends were following one trajectory before 1971, and almost at the very same point in history completely diverged from the trajectory that they were following before, and almost always for the worst for humanity. So again, I'll do another video on it another time, but I do recommend you check out that website. And what's clear is that Kjell himself has clearly been down that rabbit hole as well. So again, he gets Bitcoin from a lot of different perspectives, deserves real credit for kind of being open-minded enough, despite being an older chap. I think he's in his 60s, but clearly has come to Bitcoin with an open mind and just has gone down the rabbit hole and just gets it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to leave you with a bit of a summary of the argument and a summary of the state of the debate around Bitcoin in the context of its energy usage. I hope you read this letter from Kjell himself. I'll leave a link to it in the description. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll leave you with a bit of a summary. So thanks for watching. Far from being some frivolous use of energy which is damaging to our environment, Bitcoin will play an integral role in any energy transition which takes place over the next few decades. As a geographically independent activity, which demands only the cheapest sources of electricity, Bitcoin will redesign the energy grid in its image. Aker chairman Kjell Inge Rokke believes that Bitcoin may accelerate the energy transition by improving the economics for new renewable projects. As a man with great skin in the game, his opinion is worth listening to. What's more, Bitcoin is worth the energy it consumes. It's easy to judge from a privileged position in the West that we don't need a new, non-inflationary global reserve asset. But that's a very privileged position. Proponents should speak to people from Argentina or Turkey who've recently watched their purchasing power evaporate and the value of the currencies they used to save get decimated. In protecting people's purchasing power against the ravages of inflation, Bitcoin will unlock human ingenuity as people become freed from the rat race that sees them become indebted to earn an education, to get a job, to earn money that depreciates in value every year, keeping people from ever getting the financial and even cognitive freedom to work on meaningful things. Bitcoin is misunderstood by those within the mainstream media because their salaries are dependent on the very system that Bitcoin will inevitably disrupt. To understand Bitcoin, you need to pay less attention to legacy media publications and more attention to those who've been right about Bitcoin and energy for years. A Bitcoin future is a hopeful future, one in which humanity can continue to improve its quality of life, while people can enjoy the freedom and prosperity that comes from being able to access a simple store of value that respects their work and their time. I'll end on a quote from Aker chairman Kjell Inge Rokke. If Bitcoin is a bubble, it dies and consumes nothing. If it's digital gold, it's more efficient and will emit much less than the asset it disrupts. And if it's really successful, it It's because of demand from truly value-creating applications that define our future and should be worth the electricity.